Hi everyone and welcome. We're preparing to go down into my wormery, but before we do, we're going to check in on my tracking spreadsheet. So the bin that I'm interested in looking at right now is the one that's down here. It's the last one on the list. It's not really a composting tub. It's really a tub that was meant to just hold the castings. After harvesting this bin back here on the 14th of October, 47 days ago, I had placed the finished castings into a tub. And the idea was just to let them dry because they came out of the composting bin rather damp. And then it was a few days later, about 5 days later, that somebody had suggested that I try baiting whatever worms might have ended up in that compost out. Because they did observe while I was harvesting that batch of compost that the worms had not all made their way into the horizontal feeding zone, and that the harvested castings did appear to have a fair number of worms in them. So in an attempt to try to fish out some of those worms and keep them as part of my composting population, it was back here 42 days ago, so 6 weeks ago, that I had placed in a baiting box. It was a box with some holes in it and some bait and bedding and some material that was intended to lure the worms out of the material. And it did a pretty good job, and it lured a number of worms out. So I reloaded it, gave it a second feeding, a third feeding, and as you can see, this was done on six intervals of 6 days in between each. And then by this one, by the third time, I had noticed that just so few worms were coming out of the material that I figured I'd wait a little longer. And the last time we checked in on the bin, last two times, we'd actually waited 12 days between each period. So once again, the last time I've checked in on this bin was 12 days ago, and it seemed like it was time to pop in on there one more time and see how things are progressing. So I'll be curious to see if we've managed to bait out any worms. And I guess now that that bin has been sitting for 47 days now, that's ample time for any cocoons that might have been in the material to have hatched out. So my hope on checking in on this is that I begin seeing some baby worms, some freshly hatched baby worms making their way into this bait box. Because otherwise, if not, I'm just going to assume that this material is truly worm free, and it's a done deal. So I might not really need to bother with it any further. So let's head on down to the wormery and take a look at what's happening in there. So this is the container that the castings are in down here on the bottom. Now on top of it, I just have a bin turned upside down. What was originally covering the castings was what I normally use, which is a sheet of newspaper with some cardboard to try to keep the moisture down within the material. But it seemed to me like creating this terrarium effect was doing a better job keeping the moisture in. And even though you could see there's perforations on the top of this bin, I was using the piece of cardboard to even cover up those holes. Because I really wanted the moisture to stay in this now. Because originally, like I said earlier, the material was too damp, so it was placed in this bin to air out and dry. But over time, I was really starting to feel that the material had finally gotten to that nice point where it was not too damp anymore. So I really didn't feel like that was the objective of it being in this container any longer. I felt like the moisture level had gotten to the right level. I think it's just right at this point. So let's just peel back some of the material that the bait box is buried into here. Because sometimes it's right here in the neighboring material that we actually find worms kind of circling the bait box but not really entering it. So I want to inspect that surrounding material too, just to see if there are any worms in it before we inspect the box itself. So let's see what we can see over here, just probing around the material that was immediately around the bait box. See if we could spot any little worms hanging out. This is pretty much what we saw last time too. We came in here looking to see if we could spot any worms, and we found pretty much nothing. It's a little bit surprising too, because I would have almost, I would have almost said that I was certain that this material is going to be chock full of worm eggs, and that by this time it will be teeming with baby worms cruising around all over the place, looking for a bite to eat, looking for fresh grit to process their food. So it's just a little bit surprising, I guess, to not find baby worms all over the place. But then again, we haven't looked in here yet, right? So let's inspect the contents of this and see what we got. All right, so just one more time really quick, as we've done in the past, we're going to spill out the contents of this bait box just to see what's brewing inside, if anything. And I guess the hope is that we're going to see some baby worms. I'm just going to lay this down here so that I can put this here without it getting too messed up and dirty. And let's empty this box and see what we've got inside. Oh, there we go. Definitely rounded up a couple worms. I don't think the remaining material within the box has any more worms in it. I'm just going to scoop it out so we have a nice empty box to start with here. So, these little guys, they're definitely not appreciating the fact that I just cracked open their little party. There's not a lot of worms in here at all. There's 2 or 3. I'm trying to remember now. Maybe it was in the last. Were there any worms last time? Or did we reset this in the hopes that we would find worms even though we didn't see any last time? I can't remember. And these are big adult worms. Neither of these, you know, not even one of these worms looks like a juvenile. These all look like big, healthy, well-fed, mature worms that don't appreciate me messing with them. I don't know if you were counting, but I saw 3 so far, so I'm trying to establish whether that's correct or not. Look at this little guy holding on so strong. There's 1, there's 2. I'm pretty sure I saw a 3rd worm cruising around somewhere in here, but I could be mistaken. Maybe I just saw like the head and the tail of the same worm at the same time sticking out of the material. Oh no, there we go. This 3rd worm is not quite as big as the others. A little bit smaller in size. And I'm trying to see if it's got the telltale signs of being mature enough to be of breeding age, and I don't think I see that yet. I don't think I see that little bulge on their body, that clitellum or whatever it's called, that would indicate that it's a worm that's mature enough to breed. On this one you could see it, clearly see that it's got that sort of bulge on its body right there. But this little guy does not have that, so it does look like we've got at least 1 juvenile worm in here, but the other 2 are mature worms. And you know, it really does make me wonder if it's worth the effort to reload this and let it keep going, or if it's time to just call this quits. You know, I've always tried to use various bits of rationale to make my next decision on things, and in the past I think the main rationale with this has been that I'm not really in a hurry to use these castings. So, you know, if the stuff sits for a little longer, it's fine by me. It really wouldn't matter. I'm just questioning whether it's necessary to add more food and bedding, because I mean, if you look at this stuff here, it looks like there's bedding, you know, there's paper in here, which in itself is food as well. And you can see bits of green as well, which, you know, suggests that not all the food that they received most recently has been consumed yet. And I mean, 3 worms trying to consume, you know, a wad of food, you know, it could take some time. They're not really a big hungry mob. It's just 3 little worms hanging out. And I mean, for that matter, I'm wondering if it would make sense for me to actually extract these little guys and move them over into one of my active worm bins. In the past, I had just left whatever worms I found in here because there were so few of them, and returned it all back into the bait box. Maybe it was because I was anticipating not finding worms the next go around, and I figured let me at least put a couple in there so I'm ensured that I'm going to find at least 1 or 2 worms on the next go around. And you know, it does make me wonder if these big worms might be just distracting me from what maybe there are some baby worms in here that I'm just not seeing because I'm dealing with such a big gloop, big wad of goop over here. I wonder if I just kind of move this stuff around a little bit and let it sit for a second, if I might be able to notice some movement, some smaller sized little creatures moving around in here, other than the three obvious worms that we've already spotted. I just keep thinking it would be so nice to see some baby worms cruising around in here and kind of validate the original theory, which was that, hey, there must be worms that are going to be emerging from from cocoons, because there must be tons of cocoons in this material, and it's just a matter of time before we start seeing the emergence of those little baby worms cruising around. But every time I see a little thin strand of something that I think might be a worm, it usually isn't. Like even here, this looks like a millipede, not even a worm. And then here too, we've got some longer strands of something, but they're not moving. Oh, speaking of moving, this little guy wants to move out of the box and get back into the compost. And it's because of the bright lights I have overhead. Sorry, buddy. We'll get you back into a more comfortable environment soon. So decisions, what to do next. Yeah. I'm inclined to think that this material might actually work fine if I just place it right back into the bait box, maybe place it on top of a little bit of fresh bedding. But the moisture level and the gooiness of it, and I'm sure that there's all kinds of food substance mixed in this that might be appealing to the worms as well. So maybe I'll just go ahead and put this stuff right back into the bait box, along with a little bit of fresh bedding first. And then who knows, maybe I can even grab a little chunk of something, maybe a little piece of melon or a little piece of something to go in here as fresh food alongside the this goopy material. And that should maybe make for a nice appealing spot for the worms to be drawn to. But you know what I'm going to do here? Let's pull these little guys out. Let's get this little guy over here too. This little guy is really anxious to get out of here. Definitely does not like the overhead lights. So I'm going to take these little guys and drop them into one of my other active worm bins. Alright, well, after I released those 3 worms into one of my active worm bins, I shot upstairs to my freezer, grab a little bit of food, and you can see it's certainly not a lot of food. It's just a little bit of potato peels. It's kind of frozen together into a block right now. And we're going to use this as the food supplement to this bait box, and we're going to just mark this off on my tracking spreadsheet as having been fed today, and we'll just allow it to continue a little bit longer. Because, like I said a moment ago, I'm not really in a hurry to harvest these castings. Well, to use these castings. I'm really treating these as harvested castings that I'm really trying to just depopulate at this point. So just a slight distinction in terms of how I manage my bins and my stuff. So yeah, and then I just figured I would take this this wad of partially broken down stuff and place that right on top. And that almost gets us back up to the tippy top again. I always get excited when I look inside this box and I see how much the level has dropped, and I think to myself, oh great, we've got tons of worms feeding and breaking down the material, and I don't think that's really the case. I think it just sort of, thaws, and maybe bacteria is getting into it and is breaking it down, which is fine, but what we're looking for here is worms. So not much left to do here. I'm just going to go ahead and move this aside a little bit. Move this aside a bit as well. And I guess we're going to continue the experiment. We'll create a little pit to drop this box down into. over here in the middle. Oops, like so. It's pretty good. And then we'll just loosely backfill it all the way around. And hopefully we'll see a couple more worms at the end, but I'm really beginning to think that this might be it. There might not be any baby worms coming out of the material. Maybe there were no cocoons. Maybe there will be no baby worms emerging and showing themselves, and maybe this really is just a tub of completed, finished castings at this point. So time will tell, but like I said, I'm not in a hurry, so we'll just we'll set this back up as we found it, and we'll let it continue. Except since the material is starting to get pretty dry now on the surface again, and it seems like that terrarium effect doesn't seem to be doing what I had hoped that it would do. I think I'm going to go ahead and maybe I'll cover it again with the plastic bin over the top, but I think I am going to restore the I think I'm going to restore some of these coverings just to try to help keep the moisture within the bin down in the material, as opposed to allowing it to evaporate out. And some will evaporate, but by having the container over the top, that'll help keep the moisture in as well, I think. So, all right, everyone, that's it for today. Just a quick visit in on my tub of finished castings to see if we can lure any more worms out of the material. And I'm starting to wonder if it's a done deal, but we'll see next time. So give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. If you enjoy this sort of content, then you might also want to consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. That's always really appreciated as well. So let me get things cleaned up here, but that's boring. I won't keep you around for that. With that, I'll just say goodbye and thank you for watching and have a great day.